Hello, this is Richie Venton, the Scottish Socialist Party Trades Union Organiser. Recent events, both national and international, highlight an issue which I think has been sorely neglected in the current general election campaign by all the other mainstream political parties. And that's the issue of climate chaos and what could be done about it in a fashion that both tackles pollution, global warming and poverty amongst ordinary people. We had the example of the death of the famous Dr. Michael Mosley in the intense heat on the Greek island of Symi, well over 40 degrees centigrade in the temperature, which is an indication of the fact that the planet is on fire. At the same time, there's countries like Spain and Italy where there's been extreme flooding at the very same time, an indication of the weather chaos that has been created by global warming, greenhouse gas emissions over the decades in recent times. And at the same time, back closer to home, we have the announcement by the Strathclyde Partnership for Transport, SPT, that they're doubling the cost of zone tickets for people who regularly use buses and the underground and so on to get to work and other forms of travel. And what's the connection? Well, the connection is the fact that the biggest single cause of global warming, of greenhouse gas emissions, is transport. 73% of all of Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions comes from transport, and 45% of that from cars alone. And yet, if you're punishing people with vast increases in the cost of travelling on buses, subways and trains, they cannot afford to do that, and they increasingly rely on car usage, which adds to global warming, adds to climate chaos. And when you look at what the other parties are offering in that regard, I think there's a warning from across on the European continent. We've just had the election results for the European Parliament, and the upshot of that is that there's been a surge for the far right. They've tapped into discontent and disgust towards the mainstream political parties, including the equivalent of the Labour Party, the Social Democrats in various countries, such as Germany and France. They've also tapped into the discontent with the Green parties of those countries, especially that's clear in Germany, where the Greens are in a coalition with other capitalist parties. And it results in a position where it's much less likely that any measures that tackle global warming will be carried out. But it's also because the way in which the Green parties of those countries have proposed to tackle that issue is anti-working class. And that's the same here at home. Because here at home, instead of tackling climate crisis in a fashion that will reduce poverty, will suit the needs of the working class majority in Scotland, as well as tackling pollution, then what is on offer from other parties, including the Scottish Greens, is punitive measures of road charges, of the threat of bringing in parking fees at workplaces, which is something initiated by the Scottish Green Party, agreed by the SNP, which now has been agreed by councils run by either of those parties, such as Glasgow and Edinburgh, and which is a threat of imposing £500 a year of a parking fee on any worker at a workplace with more than 10 parking spaces. Now, I think that is an utterly anti-working class way of dealing with the problem of car pollution. Car pollution is an emergency. Car usage does need to be cut. But the way to do that is by offering an alternative to people which is cleaner, which is green, which is affordable. And specifically what the Scottish Socialist Party has campaigned for well over 20 years, is free public transport. The fundamental problem with the solution to pollution and global warming that's been put forward by these Green parties across Europe, including here in Scotland, is that they're treated as an issue that has to be tackled by individuals, individualist solutions rather than collective solutions. I think that's a fundamental problem. And it ends up in a position where punitive measures are being issued against individuals instead of collective solutions. And what we have to remember is that the fundamental, as I said, main cause of global warming is transport, specifically car usage. The motor industry is a huge industry across the world. It expanded vastly in the 1950s. The reason partly being that in the aftermath of the Second World War, the threat of revolution from below forced the capitalist classes of various countries, including here, to concede increased living standards for workers, such as the National Health Service, the welfare state, improved wages at the time. In turn, what that meant was that workers began to have the money to buy cars, and the car industry vastly expanded. Associated with that also is that overworked workers, instead of cooking at home, began to go in America off the freeways into off roads which had the beginnings of the fast food industry. The McDonald's and other competing companies began to expand their so-called restaurants, and workers would leave work, go off ramp onto these fast food outlets and buy quite unhealthy food, processed food and so on, which added to obesity. So you had these twin track problems of ill health, overwork, and the pollution that went with mass car ownership. So in order to overcome those problems, you have to tackle it collectively by public ownership of the car industry, public ownership of the fossil fuel industry that fuels the cars, public ownership of energy as a whole, including renewables, and I would say public ownership of the major food industry, so we can then have a coherent, holistic approach to tackling poverty, ill health, pollution, and put forward instead measures such as free public transport, green energy production led by workers in that industry itself in a rapid transition to that, and the production of free public transport for all ages will cut down poverty and pollution. Now that would presuppose public ownership of all forms of transport, public ownership not just of the entire railway network, which incidentally would have to include the rolling stock companies that build the trains. We make billions of pounds in profit at the expense of even those sectors of railways that have been brought into public ownership, such as ScotRail. Public ownership of the railways, public ownership of the buses, which right now are privatised, deregulated, cause chaos, where they're owned by the likes of McGill's, Stagecoach, First Group, and what they do is cut the unprofitable routes, cut down access to transport at night and evenings for people, jack up the fares, where it costs a worker a minimum of £28 a week just to get to work on a bus. That's £1,400 a year. And then they slash the so-called unprofitable routes, which leaves people in social isolation. So it causes pollution as well, where the bus companies are in competition, and particularly in the likes of town or city centres, they race against each other to get the fares of the bus stops, making the air that people breathe in town centres toxic, death-threatening consumption. And all of that is the chaos caused by privatisation and the lack of planning and the lack also of accessible public transport in the sense of it being affordable. So what the Scottish Socialist Party has argued for is free public transport, publicly owned, democratically controlled, integrated, vastly expanded and improved so that there are bus services, for example, that are integrated with the timetables of railways and subways, etc., and that is free at the point of use for all age groups. Now, our campaign over the years has won the minor concession, the important concession of free travel on buses for people under 22 and over 60. But why should it just be restricted to those age groups? And why should it just be restricted to buses? What we see, as I said, is that not only is there a movement towards free travel, but it's gone the opposite direction, where the Strathclyde fares of public transport are now being doubled on the zone cards that people buy. So that, I think, is an issue that should really be advanced, and that is being advanced by the SSP during this election as a solution to pollution and poverty, because it would cut the expenditure from family pockets. It would put money in the pockets of working class people. As I said, for a start off, £28 a week, £1,400 a year being saved for people who travel by bus to and from work. It would vastly increase access to public transport and encourage use of it for people who currently cannot afford to travel and are left isolated in their homes, including the elderly and people on low incomes. It would cut down car pollution, which is the main single cause of the pollution that warms up the globe and causes the extreme weather I mentioned before. And it would put forward a programme that would attract people instead of them being prey to the populist garbage of the far right. Because actually it's linked with the whole issue of the vicious propaganda of the far right on questions of immigration. One of the reasons people are fleeing their native homes, their native lands, is of course war. Quite often wars that the likes of Britain have created and pursued, but it's also the climate chaos that causes migration. There's people who are refugees from climate chaos where their areas have been flooded by the extreme weather and the rising ocean levels and so on caused by the warming up of the globe by pollution. And all of these things are then meat for the far right to say we have to stop immigration, we have to stop all this woke nonsense about climate and so on, that deny that there's such a thing as climate change, is quite the direct opposite. Climate change helps to create migration across the globe, and instead of blaming the people who are fleeing either wars, poverty, or flooding of their homes, then we should welcome them with open arms, but also put forward a programme which would create jobs, cut down poverty, cut down pollution, all in one go. Where, for example, if you had free public transport, it would create, according to the research we've done, it would create at least 60,000 new jobs. If you had public ownership of energy as well, to have a rapid transfer, a transition led by the workers in that industry itself from fossil fuel to green energy production, it would create a minimum of 70,000 new secure skilled jobs in Scotland alone. So job creation, cut down pollution, cut down poverty is all linked with public ownership of energy of all forms, public ownership of transport of all forms, and then a rapid transition to green energy production, but also rapidly introducing free public transport for people of all ages. I think those are policies that need to be projected with force to counter poverty, pollution and confusion, which leaves people open to the vicious propaganda and the divisiveness of the far right. So I hope that people increasingly will listen to that idea of socialist change instead of climate change, and free public transport instead of poverty and pollution.